A global storm is brewing. The BRICS Emergency Summit has just sent shockwaves across the world. But here's the twist no one expected. Zambia, and even the Lungu family's ongoing case, are now being dragged into the center of this international drama. How did a burial appeal and a family court battle find their way into the halls of BRICS? Stay tuned, because the answers may change how you see Zambia's role in global politics forever. The BRICS Emergency Summit has captured the world's attention, but what's surprising is how Zambia's politics and the Lungu family case are now being linked to this global drama. In this video, we uncover why the BRICS nations called an emergency meeting, how Zambia's internal politics and Edgar Lungu's case in court are connected to larger global shifts, what this means for Zambia, Africa, and the balance of power against Western influence. This is not just about BRICS, it's about Zambia's hidden role in shaping the future of Africa. The call to arms. It began with whispers, messages flashing across secure lines, phones ringing in presidential palaces from Beijing to Brasilia. Something urgent, something so serious, had forced the world's most powerful emerging nations into an unscheduled gathering. For the first time in years, the BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, was called into an emergency session. The world took notice. After all, BRICS was no ordinary club. It represented nearly half of humanity, vast wealth, and a growing defiance against Western dominance. For them to meet without warning meant a storm was brewing. But the question lingered, what crisis had united them so suddenly? Some pointed to the global economy, teetering under inflation, sanctions, and wars. Others whispered about oil routes, rare earth minerals, and secret military deals. Yet in the corridors of Pretoria, another name surfaced, a name no one expected to echo inside a summit of giants, Edgar Lungu. At first glance, the connection seemed absurd. How could the burial dispute of a former Zambian president find its way into discussions among the world's superpowers? But as diplomats traded notes, the truth grew clearer. Zambia's political turmoil was no longer a local affair. It had become a symbol, a test of Africa's sovereignty in the face of global power games. The call to arms was not only about finance or war. It was about who would control the narrative of Africa's future. Would Zambia's crisis be handled by African leaders alone? Or would outside powers, East and West, seize the moment to tighten their grip? As the BRICS leaders prepared to face one another, one thing was certain. The emergency meeting would not only reshape alliances. It would reveal why Zambia, a nation of just 20 million, had suddenly become the stage for a battle far larger than itself. The world was watching. And BRICS was about to answer. Whispers of Zambia. In the quiet corridors of the BRICS Emergency Summit, one word kept surfacing in hushed tones: Zambia. To the outside world, it seemed impossible. Why would a nation so small compared to giants like China and Russia matter at such a high table? But behind closed doors, Zambia was being whispered about not as a bystander, but as a symbol of Africa's struggle for sovereignty in a world of competing empires. At the center of it all was the case of Edgar Lungu. His disputed burial rights had sparked protests, court battles, and international headlines. For many in the West, it was just another African political drama. But for BRICS, it was something more, proof that even in death, African leaders could be used as pawns in global games. Whispers in Pretoria suggested that if Zambia could be swayed, if its sovereignty could be undermined, then so could any other African state. That possibility rattled South Africa, the only African voice inside BRICS. It forced leaders in Beijing and Moscow to ask, was the Lungu affair simply a family tragedy, or was it a test of whether Africa truly belonged to Africans? As intelligence briefings circulated, diplomats began connecting dots. Lungu's name appeared in reports on international financing networks, on leaked passport files, even in quiet conversations about resource deals. Each revelation deepened the suspicion that Zambia's crisis was no longer just Zambia's. It was tied to the global struggle over who controlled Africa's wealth and destiny. And so, the whispers grew louder. What seemed like a burial dispute now stood as a proxy for a bigger battle, East against West, sovereignty against interference. For BRICS leaders, Zambia was no longer a distant headline. It had become a test case, and the whispers in Pretoria warned of a storm about to break. The hidden hand. Every great power struggle has its shadows, the figures who never stand before cameras, yet pull the strings from behind the curtain. In the case of Zambia and BRICS, these shadows began to reveal themselves. Whispers spoke of diplomats meeting in secret hotels, lawyers exchanging coded messages, and financiers moving money across borders in carefully disguised channels. This was the hidden hand, the quiet force linking Zambia's internal turmoil to the global chessboard of BRICS. At the center were lobbyists and political fixers, men and women whose loyalty was not to Zambia, nor to BRICS, but to influence itself. Some advised the Lungu family, promising protection and sympathy abroad. Others courted Lusaka's government, urging alignment with one superpower over another. All of them understood one truth: whoever controlled Zambia's narrative could tilt Africa's future. Documents leaked during the summit hinted at clandestine meetings in Johannesburg, where promises were made in exchange for silence. There were reports of international law firms crafting burial petitions with input not just from Zambia, but from interests in London, Washington, and even Moscow. To the BRICS leaders, this was alarming. If foreign powers were secretly fueling Zambia's drama, then the case was no longer about one man's burial. It was about sovereignty itself, about whether Africa could write its own story without invisible pens guided from the outside. For South Africa, the revelations were particularly damning. Pretoria faced the question head-on. Was it merely hosting Zambia's courtroom battle, or was it being used as a stage for global influence? The hidden hand was everywhere, yet nowhere. It left no fingerprints, but its presence was undeniable, in the sudden flow of money, in the mysterious leaks, in the way Zambia's tragedy had grown into an international spectacle. And as the BRICS summit heated up, leaders began to ask the question that would define the meeting: who truly benefits from keeping Zambia in turmoil? Storm at the table. The BRICS Emergency Summit was meant to be a show of unity. Instead, it became a storm. Inside a secure conference hall in Pretoria, 5 leaders sat around a long polished table. The world expected calm diplomacy, but behind closed doors, tempers flared. The issue of Zambia and the Lungu case had cracked open deeper divisions. China, focused on its Belt and Road ambitions, warned that instability in Zambia threatened investment routes stretching from Lusaka to the Indian Ocean. Russia, meanwhile, argued that the West was using Lungu's death to destabilize African politics, a tactic Moscow claimed it had seen before. India, cautious but firm, urged BRICS to avoid being dragged into funeral politics, warning that the alliance should focus on economics, not graves. Brazil sided with neutrality, but privately admitted it feared that Africa's crises could spill into global markets. And then came South Africa, caught in the middle, yet bearing the heaviest weight. As host to the Lungu family's court battles, Pretoria demanded that BRICS recognize Zambia's crisis not as a local affair, but as a continental flashpoint. South African officials argued that ignoring Zambia would be a betrayal of Africa's sovereignty. The room grew tense. Voices rose, fists struck the table. Each leader carried not just their nation's agenda, but also the fear of losing ground to rivals. What was supposed to be a summit of cooperation had become a battlefield of words. At one point, according to insiders, the discussion nearly collapsed. Delegates whispered of walkouts, of fractured unity, of a BRICS alliance unable to withstand the pressure. The storm at the table threatened to break apart the very coalition that had called the meeting. But in the chaos, one truth became clear: Zambia's crisis was no longer about Edgar Lungu alone. It had become a test of BRICS itself, a question of whether this alliance could rise above division or fall apart under the weight of global suspicion. The storm had passed for the night, but the cracks remained. Africa's bargaining chip. As the BRICS summit raged on, one uncomfortable truth hung in the air. Africa was not just present at the table, it was the bargaining chip. For centuries, Africa's wealth had been extracted by outsiders. Gold, copper, cobalt, oil, all traded away while ordinary Africans were left with little more than promises. Now, in the heart of Pretoria, that history echoed once again, only with new players on the board. Zambia, reeling from the controversy of Edgar Lungu's death and the political standoff over his burial, suddenly became more than a domestic crisis. For BRICS, it was a symbol, a frontline in the global struggle for influence. China framed Zambia as proof of Africa's centrality to global trade. Without stability in Lusaka, one Chinese delegate warned, Africa's entire economic corridor collapses. Russia, never one to miss a chance at rhetoric, declared that Africa was being used as a pawn by Western powers, and BRICS must shield the continent from neo-colonial claws. But it wasn't just ideology. It was business. Behind closed doors, Deals were whispered: mining concessions, infrastructure projects, military training agreements. Africa's voice was in the room, but its future was being priced in backroom negotiations. Zambian representatives who had been quietly invited to Pretoria found themselves in a difficult position. They were courted with promises of loans, debt relief, and protection, but each offer came with invisible strings attached. South Africa tried to turn the moment into an assertion of continental pride, insisting that Africa was not for sale. Yet even within BRICS, the divide was clear. To some, Africa was a partner. To others, it was leverage. By dawn, the truth was undeniable. Africa, and Zambia in particular, had become the chessboard on which great powers moved their pieces. Lungu's legacy was no longer just about his life or death. It was about whether Africa could finally step out of the role of bargaining chip and claim its rightful place as a player. The question was simple, yet terrifying. Would BRICS elevate Africa or exploit it? The secret cable. Just as the BRICS summit seemed ready to collapse under the weight of arguments, a whisper spread through the conference hall. A leak, a document, a cable that none of the leaders were meant to see. It was said to have come from a Western intelligence agency, intercepted by South African officials and quietly circulated among the delegations. The cable revealed a startling claim, that the controversy over Edgar Lungu's burial was being deliberately fueled by external powers to weaken Zambia and, by extension, BRICS' credibility in Africa. The language was chilling. It spoke of funeral diplomacy, of using Zambia's mourning period as a pressure point, of ensuring that Lusaka remained divided and dependent. The implication was clear. If true, then Lungu's death had been transformed into a geopolitical weapon. The document didn't name names, but hints were obvious. Fingers pointed at Washington, London, and even Brussels. Yet the authenticity of the cable was immediately questioned. Was it genuine? Or was it a fabrication, planted by one BRICS member to push the others into alignment? Inside the summit, the mood shifted. Russia seized on the leak, calling it proof of Western interference. China echoed the claim, urging BRICS to tighten its hold over African partnerships. India and Brazil were more cautious, warning that a single cable, authentic or not, should not dictate the alliance's decisions. But behind the rhetoric, the tension deepened. Leaders wondered aloud. Had they been discussing Zambia's crisis freely, or had every word already been anticipated by unseen ears? By midnight, the secret cable had become the most talked about item in Pretoria. It was no longer about whether Lungu's burial should happen in Zambia or abroad. It was about whether Africa's sovereignty was under surveillance, manipulated by shadows beyond its borders. The summit's agenda had changed. The funeral of a former president had morphed into a battlefield of espionage, suspicion, and betrayal. One question echoed in the halls. If Africa's mourning could be turned into a weapon, what would be next? The midnight deal. It was past midnight in Pretoria, but the summit was far from over. The air inside the conference hall had grown heavy, not just with fatigue, but with the weight of decisions that could reshape the world. Behind closed doors, a smaller group broke away from the main assembly. Not the full BRICS membership, but select power players, South Africa, China, and Russia, gathered in a private chamber. Their goal was simple: cut a deal before dawn. For Pretoria, the issue was survival. Hosting the Lungu family and managing the burial dispute had placed South Africa under enormous strain. Protests outside the court, pressure from Lusaka, and now whispers of espionage meant the crisis could no longer be contained. China came to the table with offers, billions in infrastructure investment for Zambia, but in exchange, BRICS would take a united stance against what it called foreign meddling in African affairs. Russia, more aggressive, pushed for military cooperation, training programs, intelligence sharing, even weapons transfers, under the banner of protecting Africa's sovereignty. But South Africa hesitated. The price of such promises was high. Was this truly about Zambia, or was Zambia being used as a pawn in a much larger chess game? According to insiders, the talks dragged on for hours. Papers were signed, then torn apart. Voices rose, hands slammed against polished wood. At one point, Pretoria's delegation reportedly threatened to walk out, insisting that Zambia's dignity could not be traded for geopolitical favors. And then, silence. An agreement, fragile but binding, was struck. By morning, BRICS would present a united front, condemning external interference in Africa, pledging deeper support for Zambia, and promising that Lungu's case would be handled with respect for sovereignty. But what the public would never see were the hidden terms, the midnight promises, whispered in shadows, where Africa's future was negotiated without its people in the room. The midnight deal was not just about Zambia. It was about control, who held it, who lost it, and who would pay the price in the years to come. The aftermath. When the sun finally rose over Pretoria, the BRICS summit had ended, but the world outside was left asking more questions than answers. Officially, the closing statement was polished and diplomatic. The leaders declared their commitment to Africa's sovereignty, pledged support for Zambia, and condemned foreign interference in the continent's affairs. To the cameras, it looked like unity. To the headlines, it was victory. But inside the corridors of power, everyone knew the truth. The alliance had barely held together. The storm at the table, the leaked cable, the midnight deal, all had left scars that no press release could hide. For Zambia, the aftermath was even more complicated. The burial of Edgar Lungu remained unresolved. Families mourned, courts delayed, and citizens wondered whether their former president had become a pawn in a geopolitical game larger than the nation itself. In Lusaka, whispers grew louder. Had BRICS really acted in Zambia's interest, or in their own? Was the promise of debt relief and investment genuine, or just another layer of dependency wrapped in new colors? Meanwhile, in Washington, London, and Brussels, diplomats studied the BRICS statement carefully. If the leaked cable was real, then the West had been exposed. If it was fake, then BRICS had just played one of the boldest propaganda moves of the century. Either way, Zambia had become the center of a tug-of-war between competing empires. The world stage shifted. Investors hesitated. Analysts warned that the cracks within BRICS could widen at any moment. And Africans asked themselves the most difficult question of all. Had their continent finally become the driver of global politics, or was it still trapped as the bargaining chip? The cameras were gone. The delegates had flown home. But in the shadows of Pretoria's halls, one truth lingered. The BRICS summit had not solved the crisis. It had only revealed it. And for Zambia, the real battle, for sovereignty, for dignity, for control of its own destiny, was only just beginning.